Okay, well, good evening once again. Thanks for your patience. I had to get a little charged up here for this talk, so this is the last talk I'm going to give at this event. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Waz and everyone else that made this event possible. This is a great gathering. I've had a wonderful time. You're all wonderful people, and I will be back if you invite me. So here we go. The title of this talk is a little more complicated than it says on the board there. It's kind of heavily leans heavily on neuroscience. And as you can see, the consciousness and spirituality, neuroscience, the mind, brain, and parallel universes. This is essentially the same talk. I'm sorry, but it is the same talk I gave at a couple of the Lost Tribes EGA tour. How many of you have seen this presentation? We're on one of those tours, on one of those appearances. Oh, well, you can be excused if you want. I mean, feel free to fall asleep or leave or whatever. I won't be offended, or feel free to, stick around. Did want to mention again, I have an official I have a couple of official affiliations, but the Hefter Research Institute, which is the one that doesn't get any attention, is one that we're a nonprofit organization in the States sponsoring and developing research projects with psilocybin especially, but other psychedelics as well. And if you want to know more about what we're doing, visit the hefter.org website. There's a lot of exciting work going on there. For the first time in many years, there is actually an openness in the structure, in the biomedical power structures to let this work go forward. And so it is going forward. So if you want to learn more about what the Hefter's up to, and some of our fine affiliates and members of the board are also the leading investigators in the neurosciences of psychedelics. So it's a good organization, and find out about it. So let's see here. I don't know. What do I do here? All right. So here we go. This is a couple of observations about the brain, about neuroscience. I like this quotation: "The universe exists for us only insofar as it exists in our brain. The brain is our 3-pound universe. Each of us lives within the universe, the prison of his or her own brain." Well, that may or may not be true, and we'll talk about whether or not that's true a little bit later. But it's an interesting thing to think about, that we are, in fact, the world that we regard as reality is actually, in some ways, at least in part, a confabulation of that 3 pounds of spongy pink tissue encased within our skulls. Mostly the slide is just an excuse to show this gentleman who made the ultimate sacrifice for science way back when, from De Humane Corporis Fabrica. I love the seriousness of the expression on his face. If you'd been decapitated and had your brain dissected, you'd be serious too, probably. Anyway, think about it for a minute. The brain is the most complex object in the known universe. And in physical systems, complexity often exemplifies emergent properties. We get physical, chemical processes that, the more complex they become, eventually result in living processes, and then those systems become ever more complex, and they lead ultimately to consciousness. And that is an emergent property out of this enormous complexity, and there is no more complex object that we know of than the human brain. The number of synapses in an adult brain is estimated to be between 100 and 500 trillion. And the synapses, as you know, are the connections between neurons. These are the switching points that let neurons talk to each other. The Milky Way galaxy is estimated to contain only about 100 billion stars. So if each synapse in the brain is a star, our brains are the equivalent to 1,000 galaxies. So you do, in fact, have a whole universe right there in your heads. But we have a problem in thinking about this and trying to think analytically about this. In trying to understand the brain, we have to use our brains to think about our brains. So that makes it difficult to step out of the box, out of the conceptual box that we find ourselves in. Our usual analytical tools break down. It's about the same dilemma as a fish might face in trying to understand water. But in the last 150 years or so, there has been great progress, mainly through the disciplines, the scientific disciplines of neurophysiology and neurochemistry, which really go hand in hand. That wasn't supposed to be there. Okay. Neurophysiology and neurochemistry really go hand in hand because the brain ultimately, like the rest of us, is a biochemical engine. It runs on neurotransmitters and hormones, and that is the functional basis of its function, of its operation. But the neurophysiology is more or less the structure, the structure and the processes that go on in there. So our picture of the human brain is far from complete, but we have a much more comprehensive picture now than we had, even 50 years ago, even 20 years ago. The picture is we're filling in the gaps and filling in the details. So we now have a much better idea how the brain structures are related to brain functions and to the, if you will, the distribution, the division of labor that the brain exemplifies as these different functions are found localized in different parts of the brain. And all of this is important because it's related to what we experience as being, as consciousness, our subjective experience. This is the engine that is, if not, well, again, we can't say for sure that it is creating consciousness, but it is certainly modulating consciousness. And so if we look at these structures here in the brain, we can identify areas and associate those with functions, such as the frontal lobe is associated with concentration and planning and decision making, the kind of executive functions that we think of as the I function. We have Broca's area and Wernicke's area. These are important parts of the brain that have to do with language comprehension and language generation. Large amounts of the motor cortex, the primary motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, are devoted to language generation and controlling the facial muscles that enable us to generate language and also to receive that input and comprehend it. We have attention networks. We have parts of the brain that have to do with focus. And that's located in the posterior part of the brain, in the occipital lobe. In that same part of the brain, we find functions related to vision, the so-called visual cortex, olfaction, the sense of smell, the cerebellum, which is a motor function that helps us keep our balance, the temporal lobe. Lots of interesting things are going on here. We'll get into that later. But it is, in part, the part of the brain that helps us localize ourselves in space and time. Other parts of the brain are concerned with audition, hearing, and there seem to be complementary functions where there is often, for example, language is a good example. There are parts of the brain having to do with comprehension of language and other complementary parts having to do with generating language. So the brain is a balanced system, and if we can kind of break these down into different functional areas, and this is just a further sort of unpacking of that diagram. There's the auditory association area. That's part of the temporal lobe. It's temporal because it's on the side, right? It processes auditory information, whereas the auditory cortex, also in the temporal lobe, basically detects sound quality, detects the inputted signal. The motor association cortex, in part of the frontal lobe, coordinates our movement. The prefrontal cortex, just behind the frontal lobe in the brain, controls our high-order thinking, our executive thinking, and many of our emotional functions. The primary motor cortex in the parietal lobe controls voluntary movement and muscle contraction. This is the part that gets disturbed in conditions like Parkinsonism, where you lose a lot of the motor control. Other types of motor dysfunctions are involved with damage or degeneration of the primary motor cortex. The primary somatosensory cortex, again in the parietal lobes, receives tactile information, the sense of touch, and controls our voluntary response to that kind of input. The sensory association cortex in the parietal lobe, and a part of the brain that is not in that diagram called the insula, that you can't see because it's inside of all these lobes, processes multiple body sensations such as taste, smell, and touch, and integrates those into a coherent sense of perception. The speech center, Broca's area, in the frontal lobe, is involved with speech production and articulation and the movement of the mouth. The visual association area in the occipital lobe is involved with visual recognition. The visual cortex is involved with receiving the visual input from the eyes, and essentially it's a screen. It paints the image from the neural image from the eyes on the back of the occipital cortex, and that's the visual part of the occipital cortex. Wernicke's area, again a language-related area in the temporal lobe, is involved with comprehension of language. So that's kind of the tools that we have to work with, if you will. And this complex, extremely complex human brain is a reflection of millions of years of evolution. There is nothing else like it in nature. No other animal's brain, on this planet at least, approaches ours in complexity or in the sort of panoply of tricks that it can do, as we all know. So that's kind of what we can look at the brain and marvel, but do we have answers to these questions? What is consciousness? Does consciousness originate in the brain? Is it something that the brain generates? What is the self? We all have a sense of being a self, of being an integrated entity. If we don't, we're mentally ill. That's one of the symptoms. And where is the self in the brain, or is it in the brain? Can we point to one of these functional areas and say, there it is, there's the self, and if you cut it out, you don't have a self anymore? Well, no, it's not that simple, unfortunately. Everybody's wondered about these questions for centuries, even before there was neurophysiology and neuroanatomy and neurochemistry. And we're not going to answer these questions definitively tonight because at the moment neuroscience, as advanced as it is and as impressive as it is still a nascent science. It's still really very young. And I think this is the challenge for the 21st century in the biosciences, is to relate brain science, neuroscience, to the science of consciousness. We know there's a close connection. We have more questions, more unanswered questions than we do answers at this point. But, those scientists are pretty clever, so they're working on it, and they're finding out some interesting things. Often in science, especially in the medical sciences, if you want to know how a process works, if you want to know what the regulatory parameters are for a function like speech or vision or, any of the things our brain does, and it extends beyond neuroscience. If you want to know how a system works, perturb the system, break the system, look at systems that are not working correctly, and then you can compare those with so-called normal systems, and you can say, what's gone wrong here? What's different about the abnormal functioning? And that can give you insights, sometimes very powerful insights. So this gentleman here, Ramachandran at UC San Diego, he has written a very interesting book, several actually, but one called Phantoms in the Brain, where he works with people who have amputations, and they have phantom limb phenomena. In other words, they've lost an arm or a leg, but as far as they're concerned, as far as their internally generated body image is concerned, they still have that arm, they still have the leg, they can feel it. If it can feel pain, it can feel definitely attached to the body. But under some circumstances, you can get some very weird situations because they don't actually have that missing limb, and yet their body image, their brain is generating this body image that insists that they have it. But sometimes they'll say, well, my arm is attached to, that other patient across the room in the hospital room, and things like that. So this tells us that, the organization of the brain and what we perceive is often there are underlying processes that if they get disrupted, you can get some very strange things going on. I don't know if any of you are aware of the neuroscientist and popular writer Oliver Sacks. But if not, I recommend some of his work. He has a wonderful book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And, it's a series of vignettes about different bizarre neurological aberrations and how these people dealt with it. Another one of his chapters talks about a person who completely lost their short-term memory. So they remember what happened to them in childhood and years ago, but they don't remember that, 3 minutes ago you came into the room, and you leave the room and you come back into the room, and it's like they've never seen you before. They've never met you. This might be, your wife, your daughter, whatever. And so these aberrational, the study of these aberrations can tell us a great deal about how the brain works. And one of the things that Ramachandran's been concerned with, has been pondering, is what is this relationship between what he calls qualia. This is our subjective experience of the self and our external world and our place in it, our interactions with it, and the processes that are mediating these perceptions and our sense of being a self in the world. And he postulates that qualia, this sense that we have of being, essentially, is a composite of interactions between many selves. He says there isn't just one self. There's more than one self, but it's all melded together into a coherent, essentially, drama, if you will, or play that gives us this sense of coherency, continuing, continuity in time, location in space. All of these things are part of this integrative process. So essentially they comprise a simulation of subjective experience. They comprise, didn't mean to do that. Essentially, this interaction of the many selves creates a simulation of subjective experience. In other words, the movie or hallucination, if you like, that we live in, that we call reality. And most of the brain's activities that maintain this fiction of the self never impinge on consciousness. The parts that are actually involved with making the play go on, if you will, are very relatively small and relatively few parts of the brain. there's a lot of housekeeping going on in the background that we're just simply not aware of. So it really is like putting on a play. I mean, you've got the actors on the stage, you've got the stage crew that's making sure the furniture is moved around and the curtains go up and the lights change at the right time. But a good deal of it is going on in the background and you're never aware of it. So the brain is very much like that in terms of the way it constructs a fiction and gives us the experience of being that we're hopefully all familiar with. So he talks about the 7 cells. He postulates 7 cells and their different functions, and they can be localized to different parts of the brain. There is, in his scheme, the embodied self. That's responsible for body image, our sense of how big we are and where we are and what we look like. Disturbances of body image are seen, for example, in anorexia and sometimes, bulimia and these types of disorder, where often the person feels that they're extremely fat, and in fact they're not fat at all. They're unhealthily skinny, but they have this distorted body image. This is one of the conditions that we're looking into for entheogens to possibly treat, because body images, can be modulated that way. That is associated with the parietal lobes and the projections to the frontal lobes in the brain. There's the passionate self, the part of the self that mediates our emotions and our personality. That's that's localized more or less in the temporal lobes, and a very small part, a small kind of grape-shaped structure in the center of the brain called the amygdala. And for as small as it is, the amygdala does a whole lot. There is the executive self, the part of the self that is involved with the conception of actions and the execution, making decisions, and then acting on that. That's associated with a part called the anterior cingulate gyrus and projections into the motor cortex, which makes sense. The motor cortex is involved in projecting an action into the world. There's the mnemonic self. There's the memory self, the part that generates our personal story, our sense of being on a continuous timeline. That involves the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the temporal lobes. There is the unified self, which is the part that fills in the gaps of all these other cells that are interacting, that essentially glues it all together into a coherent sense of time and space. So it's kind of like the editor function. If you were making a film, you have many different film clips, you have to somehow patch them together so it all makes sense. That's what the unified self does. There is the vigilant self, the part that interacts primarily with the external world, that tracks what's going on. That's the perceptual self, that keeps an eye open to the external world and monitors what's going on. That's associated with the anterior cingulate gyrus, the thalamic nuclei, and the brainstem. You don't have to remember these terms. There will not be a test, And finally, there's the conceptual and the social self. This is the part mostly mediated through the cerebral hemispheres, the large hypertrophied front part of the brain that generates the I function, our sense of being an individual, having a personal concept, and a concept of ourselves as social beings. So we have a social concept as well. Well, this quote has been variously attributed to different people, but I think it was Lily Tomlin who first said, reality is a crutch for people who can't cope with drugs. Well, yes and no, as we'll get to. But in a sense, our brain is very much involved with generating this reality hallucination. It constructs a model of the unknowable real world. Physicists tell us that the world that we think is out there, as far as our instruments are concerned, is nothing like the world that we experience in everyday consciousness. And in fact, we don't know what it is. What we get is a model of the world, and that model rides on sensory inputs through this sensory neural interface there, input from the real world, output through our interactions with the real world. So essentially we build a hallucination, or we build a movie, if you will, and then we proceed to live there. Well, we can change the model very easily. We can, for example, take drugs, or we can meditate, or we can engage in other kinds of practices that alter consciousness. That changes the nature of the filters, what we're getting through this sensory neural interface. The signal, it's like changing a channel on a television set. Switch to another channel, there's a whole bunch of different input that you're getting from the real world, which is unchanged and forever unknowable. That affects your output with this unknowable real world, but it clearly stop doing that, please. I got to stop hitting me. So you change the nature of the reality model. The unknowable real world is unchanged, but the reality hallucination is completely different. So this gives rise to the notion that, well, maybe there are many realities. Maybe the physicists were right with their string theory idea, where every string is a multiple, that there are multiple universes. Perhaps in human perception, it's much the same way. There are dozens of channels. Our brains are like receivers of these signals, but they don't necessarily generate that reality. Neuroscience is unable to tell us whether the brain actually creates reality, the one that we inhabit, or whether it's more like an antenna or a television receiver or perhaps a computer. It gets input from the outside world, it processes that to a certain extent, and then it helps present that channel, if you will, that you happen to be watching. This also is one of the major challenges of neuroscience in the 21st century, is to resolve this. There is nothing in neuroscience right now that can definitively resolve this question, whether the brain generates reality or whether it generates consciousness, I should say, or it is more of a detector of consciousness. But it's a big question, because if consciousness is primary, if consciousness is a primary element of existence, then that turns Western science for the past 400 to 500 years completely on its ear. And we're going to have to rethink a whole lot of things about what we thought we knew. Well, how can we look into this? There are a couple of different tracks. We have got now better tools to investigate this question than we ever had before. The neuroscientists are very clever, and they have come up with some what you might call neurotechnologies. These are mostly brain imaging technologies. We now have ways that we can look into the brain and watch what it's doing while it's doing whatever it does. And these are different types of neuroimaging technologies, and they're useful for different things. Electroencephalography shows, it is in fact moving. Electroencephalography detects the waves of electrical activity that propagate across the surface of the brain. And that is associated with thought, with different types of perceptual functions, also with seizures, which is what this diagram up on, would be your upper right, is showing. That X is where there's an abnormal amount of electrical activity in a person probably with epilepsy. The other images, the rotating images, and the one opposite are from fMRI. These are more or less, these show you deep brain structures, but fMRI, F stands for functional. So MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, is a very important technology for looking at brain structures. In fact, this is just a static MRI shown here, but in fMRI, you can actually make a movie of what's going on in these brain structures while they're happening. So that gives us a very high-resolution way to look at these brain structures. There is also PET, positron emission tomography, which again is a way to monitor the metabolic activity in different parts of the brain. It changes. It's based on the injection of a radioactive form of oxygen and of glucose, actually, that contains a positron emitter. The brain runs on glucose. So as the glucose is burned up, the positron is emitted and it can be picked up by these detectors. So the colored parts of the brain, the parts of highest color correspond to the parts of highest metabolic activity. SPECT is another methodology that can be used, shown in the middle on the top there. I don't have an animated version of it, but SPECT stands for single photon emission computerized tomography, and you can also use that to monitor metabolic activity in certain parts of the brain. You can also label pharmaceuticals, different types of, for example, SSRIs or even entheogens, put them into the brain of the subject, and they will localize to the area that they're working and generate a signal. So these neuroimaging technologies provide us a way to look into the brain. They provide a window on the brain while it's functioning. Now, they're low resolution comparatively, and we can't really say that much. About all we can do, well, we can use these technologies in conjunction with what you might call altered state technologies, or sometimes technologies of the sacred. These are not new. These are ancient practices that people have developed for deliberately altering states of mind. But we can use neuroimaging in conjunction with altered state technologies to ask some interesting questions. What is the brain doing when you're in a state of deep meditation? What is the brain doing when you're in a state of mystical ecstasy, or on a psychedelic, or in a shamanic trance? So we can combine all of these different methods. We can take these spiritual practitioners, if you will, and we can say, okay, do your thing, meditate or pray, do your shamanic act or whatever, and now we're going to shove you into this fMRI machine and watch what's going on, and we can do that, and we can learn some interesting things about that. So by combining these technologies, we can draw some conclusions, perhaps, about, again, this is a way of looking at the brain when it's doing something abnormal in a sense, or not necessarily abnormal in the sense of dysfunctional, but something, an altered brain state that is different from what we might call the ordinary waking reality hallucination. So this gentleman here is famous for using neuroimaging technologies, SPECT and fMRI, to look at Tibetan meditators who are experienced meditators. And SPECT, as I mentioned, measures blood flow in the brain. And he found a population of Tibetan monks that were willing to donate their practices to science and be scrutinized while they were meditating. And what he found was that the image on the top shows an increased activity in the part of the frontal lobes that are involved in concentration and attention. Remember that the frontal lobes are involved with sort of, our focus on what's happening. But the image below shows that there is an increased activity in this part of the brain, but a decreased activity in the parietal lobes, which mediate our sense of orientation in space and time. So attention is heightened, but our sense of location in space and time is diminished. So that may lead to that blocking that sensory input may lead to the sense of no time, no space associated with such states, the sense of being one with the cosmos, one with everything, which is often associated with meditative states. Another form of altered state is our mystical experiences, spontaneous mystical experiences. And there is a group of Carmelite nuns who spend all of their lives meditating, praying, trying to achieve this spontaneous mystical experience, which is understood to be a union with God. And a soulless researcher at the University of Montreal is using different techniques to study these nuns while they practice this attempt to achieve the unio mystica, this profound feeling of union with God in a group, And preliminary data indicate that this experience involves brain areas involved in emotional processing, the temporal lobes, and the spatial representation of the self. Again, the parietal lobes. So that's a datum. Also, shamanism. Shamanism has been around. It's an altered state technology that's existed at least since the Paleolithic. And shamans deliberately induced altered states to access other dimensions, to interact with spirit entities, and to cure illnesses. This is largely what shamanism is. It's a set of navigation tools to explore the other dimensions that are accessible in altered states, whether those are induced through entheogens or other types of radical practices such as forensic drumming, self-flagellation, these kinds of things. Shamanism is probably the most ancient form of altered state technology. So for the shaman, the dimensions that the shaman accesses are at least as real as ordinary waking consciousness, as these paintings by Pablo Amaringo that you're probably mostly familiar with show. You know, the spirit entities, the plants, the aliens, the animal guides, all of the motifs of shamanism present in these altered states, and the shaman has, you know, the skill of the shaman is to be able to interact with these entities and, in a certain sense, bend them to his or her will, to get them to reveal information and benefit the community, such as how to cure disease or how to find where the game is going to be, and all of these things that are important for the community. Of course, there are also psychedelics, and the true psychedelics, such as LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, essentially can be thought of as a pharmacological model for transcendent experiences or mystical experiences. This graphic here shows a computer-generated model of LSD occupying the recognition site of its receptor, a kind of serotonin receptor called the 2A receptors. And this has been known for a long time, that as a class, these psychedelics interact with a specific subpopulation of serotonin receptors. Serotonin, of course, is a tryptamine. It's 5-hydroxytryptamine is the chemical name for it. And it's probably the master neurotransmitter in the brain because it mediates so many functions, such as perception, mood, sleep, eating behavior, sexual behavior. Many of the functions that we associate with higher consciousness is mediated by this neurotransmitter, which is all over the brain and, for that matter, all over the body. There are about 14 different types of serotonin receptor subtypes, and recent research has shown that what I call by definition the true psychedelics are serotonin 2A agonists. They interact specifically with the 2A subpopulation. So we can use psychedelics. Excuse me. Got to get uncharged. Does somebody have a bottle of water? My throat just is very similar to that of DMT. Even near-death experiences and out-of-body experiences. And finally, and weirdly, alien abductions and UFO encounters. Rick Strassman, as I think I mentioned last night, conducted this FDA-approved study with DMT, and at the higher doses, his subjects were reporting classical UFO encounters. He couldn't make sense out of any of that. He was approaching that as a reductionist scientist. What was he supposed to think? And what was he supposed to report back to NIH? I mean, how do you write up the summary of 3 years of research and say, well, this group of patients on high doses reported, consistently and clearly alien encounters? I mean, I think that would be the last grant that he would ever see funded. And in fact, it was, because he turned his DMT, he was so aghast or so taken back by his findings and trying to be a good reductionist biomedical scientist, he didn't know what to do. So he turned his supply of DMT back to NIH and went and meditated in a Zen monastery for 2 or 3 years. He didn't really know what else to do. As we probably know, DMT is a very short-acting experience when it's smoked or injected, but it's very overwhelming, it's very intense, and that short experience may resemble, in many people's minds, it resembles a death, rebirth type of experience. Those who have had the real thing, whatever that means, say that often, that DMT does resemble that. And it may be that this is part of the function of the pineal gland, that under normal circumstances, it doesn't, the mechanisms that make DMT in the pineal, are quiescent. They're not really activated. But like many systems, those enzymes can be induced when necessary. And so it may be that at the moment of dying, the pineal becomes activated, all the enzymes kick in, and produce a massive flush of DMT that essentially helps ease you on out as you make the transition to the other side. Not a bad function for a neurohormone. Out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences are very similar in some ways, and it's very hard to separate the neurophysiology here from the paranormal. There's actually quite a lot of interest right now in out-of-body experiences and approaching that phenomenon experimentally. In the bioethics forum in Madison last year, where I mentioned it to some people, where the focus is on consciousness and mechanisms of consciousness, there was a very interesting presentation made by a cardiologist who deals with near-death experiences all the time in his clinics. People are always, dying of heart attacks, and then they resuscitate, and they claim to have out-of-body experiences. So they're doing very simple types of ways to test this. They'll put a sign or something on top of a cabinet, or, something that you can't see from the floor. And then, they interview these people and they say, well, when you were floating 10 feet above on the ceiling, looking down at your body, did you happen to notice this sign over here? And in many cases, they actually say, yes, they did, and they can tell you what was on the sign. So what is going on? Well, I don't know, but I think that's pretty interesting. I mean, these things can be tested in pretty simple ways. So DMT often involves a sense of separation from the body and a sense of movement, a sense of moving into a vortex or moving through a tunnel of some kind. The acceleration that you experience on DMT is a big feature of that experience. And again, at high doses, there are encounters with entities that the people describe as aliens in the classic UFO abduction type scenario, similar to what some temporal lobe epilepsy patients also experience. So, these, and it may be that this is partly culture bound. If we were 100 years ago, they might say these were encounters with fairies, or other types of entities, but the fact is that people have been accessing connections with these non-human but intelligent entities that appear to exist in some dimension that's not the physical dimension for thousands of years through the use of DMT and these other entheogens. Here is some some accounts. I won't read them all, but some accounts from some of Rick Strassman's subjects recounting their high-dose experiences. The first one says, "That was real strange. There were a lot of elves. They were prankish, ornery. Maybe 4 of them appeared at the side of a stretch of interstate highway I travel regularly." Now remember, this is a person in a hospital bed hooked up to an IV, right? "They commanded the scene. It was their terrain. They were about my height. They held up placards showing me these incredibly beautiful, complex, swirling geometric scenes in them. One of them made it impossible for me to move. There was no issue of control. They were totally in control. They wanted me to look. I heard a giggling sound. The elves laughing or talking at high-speed volume, chattering, twittering." Another one, "They were trying to show me as much as possible. They were communicating in words. They were like clowns or jokesters or jesters or imps. There were just so many of them doing their funny little thing. I settled into it. I was incredibly still and felt like I was in an incredibly peaceful place. Then there was a message telling me that I had been given a gift, that this space was mine and I could go there any time. I should feel blessed to have form, to live. It went on forever. There were blue hands fluttering things, then thousands of things flew out of these blue hands. I thought, what a show. It was really healing." And like that. So, what is all this? You know, we've got the neuroscience evidence, we've got the altered state evidence, we've got, you know, other dimensions, what people report in these states of, shamanic ecstasy. A lot of tunnels seem to be involved, and movement from one through some kind of tunnel to another place. And the saucers also, maybe they present themselves as tunnels or vortexes. It's hard to say. So what is, in fact, going on with all this? Well, if we knew, I wouldn't be giving this talk because it would be unnecessary. Nobody really knows what's going on with these altered states, with consciousness in general. What we do know is this. There are striking similarities between temporal lobe epilepsy, near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psychedelic states, mystical states, prayer, shamanic ecstasy, alien abductions, and these induced brain states that you can do with electromagnetics. We know that the hallucination that we inhabit, the hallucination that we all agree and call consensus reality, and the illusion that what we experience as the self is bounded in space and time, is reinforced and maintained by a very few pieces of the neural substructures. Most of what the brain does, it does in the background. We're completely unaware of it. But when we disrupt those functioning, when we disrupt those structures, it may be then that we experience reality and the self as it truly is, as it really is. And that is infinite, unbounded, and immortal. So thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Dennis Mckenna, guys. Very, very honoured and proud to have him in Australia. On tour earlier on from EGA and Lost Tribes, brought him to Australia for Origins of Consciousness. If you missed that with Graham Hancock, it's a damn shame. But we'll open it up now for some questions, and we'll try and make it as quick as possible. We're running a little behind.
With respect to that tour and all that, I think that's going to be on, it's all been videoed, so it's going to be on some website, probably EGA website, before too long. So if you missed the actual tour, it's still out there for you. Love the internet, right?
The internet is made of awesome. So, do we have any questions?
Just an observation that Susan Blackwell also had no success with Percy God Machine, even though she's quite into psychedelics, but and all of that, because she is also an atheist.
I think it's a pretty crude technology, I mean, I'm not surprised. It doesn't work for everyone. but it points to a direction that's worth looking at, which is, of course, we know that a lot of the brain's activity can be modulated by electromagnetic waves, as you yourself have shown. You have been using electromagnetic technology to essentially attenuate or help people having difficult psychedelic experiences, isn't that right? Yeah, so we know that that we are immersed in this electromagnetic environment, and, electroencephalography measures the electrical activity in the brain. So it's not too surprising, really. I mean, I think the God machine is pretty crude, and to be honest, that information is kind of dated. I don't know where Michael Persinger is at right now, what he's up to. My guess is some pretty interesting things. He's a very creative scientist. So this is just another tool, excuse me, for looking at these brain functions, just as psychedelics are in some of these neuroimaging technologies. And we need to develop better tools like that. You can envision a time not too far in the future when we will have these more sophisticated neurotechnologies. We already are developing it. Excuse me. Through virtual reality technologies and this kind of thing. So it's not too hard to imagine a time in the future when we will be able to simulate any kind of altered state using these, if you will, neurocybernetic kinds of technologies. And I have to wonder what the authorities, are going to have to say about that when that kind of technology comes online, because that will sort of make the reality of the war on drugs more out front, more obvious what it's really about, as Charles Shaw was talking about earlier this afternoon. It's not about protecting people from toxic chemicals. That's ridiculous. If it were, tobacco and alcohol would be illegal tomorrow. No, it's about protecting people from dangerous states of consciousness, from funny ideas, if you will, that might threaten the current balance of power. That's why psychedelics are so terrifying to, so many that are, that do manipulate the reins of power. But anyway, that's a political rant. We won't get into it.
Another question here, Dennis.
You all already know the issues. Yes.
Yeah, hi Dennis. My friend who had temporal lobe epilepsy, in all his experiences with DMT, never accessed or could only peripherally access that particular interaction with that particular compound. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are with that, and if there's been any studies done on people with TLE and ingestion of DMT.
So he had temporal lobe epilepsy and DMT had no effect?
Zero, pretty much zero effect, yeah.
That's very interesting. Well, I don't know. That would be worthy of further study. I mean, that could be very important. It may be that, with that condition, maybe those receptors are somehow, already activated. And as we know, psychedelics produce tolerance very quickly, although DMT seems to be an exception to that. Most psychedelics, if you take them, over a series of days, after a few days, they will have no effect unless you markedly up the dose. DMT is an exception to that. There is no apparent tolerance, but that may be that the tolerance is almost as transient as the effect. So it only lasts a few minutes, and the tolerance is equally, ephemeral. Does anyone else have information that corroborates that experience with TLE, or know someone that has TLE who has taken psychedelics and had no effect? No, I guess it's not that. That's a very interesting datum. I'd like to talk to you more about that. I mean, that's something that ought to be looked into. But I can't shed any light on it, I'm sorry.
I think we've probably got time for one more question.
Hi, thanks, Dennis. Just wondering your thoughts about parallel realities. Would that possibly mean that maybe it's a belief-based reality?
The parallel realities are belief-based?
Possibly, yeah.
Well, this reality is belief-based, right? In a sense that we do synthesize this reality and live in it. So, yeah, I mean, it's all belief-based in the sense that, we don't, the reality that comes to our perception is, at least in part, generated by our brains. So we may be detecting signals from outside. There may be external realities. And I think it's a question of, I think your question is important because I think there's a disjunct. There is, suppose there are these other dimensions, these other realities, if you will, that are there for our perception under certain circumstances, but we bring to that, our belief systems, our cultural conditioning, our previous experiences, what in psychedelic therapy they call the set, right? Your own mindset, your own knowledge. So we bring to that our own interpretative types of understandings. So to a Christian, a devout Christian might encounter a spiritual entity, and that would be presented as one of the saints or Jesus or something, because the person is in that, in that particular cultural religious context. And another person from an indigenous culture might encounter an entity that would present itself entirely different. What the entity actually is, we can't say because we overlay it with our own, personal interpretation and our own cultural expectations. So in that sense, I think those realities are belief-based. But in the other sense, I think that we just can't answer the question. The more I see, and as evidence accumulates, is the idea that these are actually other dimensions. What that means, it's easy to throw that out. What do you actually mean by that? Are they another vibrational state that is somehow, co-contiguous with this continuum? Are they, I just don't think we have the conceptual tools to quite understand it. We should probably be talking to physicists as much as mystics. They have perhaps the models that could explain this.
Because maybe we are part of the machine elves belief system.
Maybe we're part of the machine elves?
Belief system. Their own belief system.
Right. Maybe so. Yeah, exactly. So we encounter the machine elves, and we're amazed and amused, and when they encounter us, they're equally amazed. Oh my God, these meat primates, look at that. Look at how funny they are. And indeed, that's how they seem to act. On DMT, they're delighted to see you and quite amused. And it's like, gee, you should show up more often. You're so much fun. So, very well, very, very possibly so, yeah.
Well, thank you very, 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 very much.
Okay, thank you.
So a round of applause for Dennis Mckenna.